In times of war, the true cost is often felt not only on the battlefield, but deep within the hearts of families and communities left behind. The Vietnam War left many scars, particularly on the Hmong people, who suffered unimaginable loss and trauma. In this video, we'll be diving into 4 deeply personal and harrowing stories from those who survived the war. These stories paint a vivid picture of survival, sacrifice, and the strength of the human spirit amidst unspeakable horrors. While many Americans are familiar with the Vietnam War, few know about the critical role the Hmong people played in it. The Hmong, an ethnic group from the mountains of Laos, were recruited by the Americans to fight in a secret war during the Vietnam conflict. These brave men and women risked everything, helping to rescue downed American pilots, gather intelligence, and battle the North Vietnamese forces. However, when the U.S. pulled out of Vietnam, the Hmong were left behind, forced to flee or face brutal retribution from the communist forces. Many escaped to refugee camps in Thailand, and some were eventually resettled in the United States. The stories you're about to hear are from Hmong survivors who lived through this harrowing period of history, offering a rare and deeply personal glimpse into the aftermath of a forgotten war. Before we begin, a strong warning. The stories you are about to hear contain extreme details. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. If you are sensitive to such themes, please proceed with caution or consider skipping this video. Story number 1. The communist soldiers kept coming to our village, so my parents said we were going to move to Thailand. I knew it was dangerous to stay, because the soldiers could kill us at any time. Therefore, my family and I had to go to Thailand. 2 nights before we were set to leave, my father didn't let anyone go anywhere. But I missed my girlfriend so much that I lied to my parents, telling them I was going to take a bath. I went outside, pretending like I'm going to the water area to take a bath, and then I took off for my girlfriend's village. It wasn't like we were leaving tomorrow. We were leaving in 2 days, so I figured my family would wait for me. If I was gone, they'd know I had gone to see my girlfriend. When I left the house, the sun was just beginning to set. By the time I reached my girlfriend's village, it was already dark. As I approached the edge of the village, I noticed the entire place was in darkness. During those times, many villages stayed dark because lighting a fire or a candle could alert the communist soldiers, who might come if they thought people were still there. From a distance, I heard the sound of a funeral drum. Strangely, there were no funeral bamboo instrument accompanying it, just the drum echoing from the village, as if they were holding a funeral in complete darkness. The only light was from the moon. As soon as I entered the village, a strong, rotten smell hit me. I thought about turning back, but the sound of the funeral drum reassured me that there were still people around. My girlfriend and her mother had been waiting for her father to return from the battlefield. I knew they were probably planning to leave for Thailand too. I made my way to my girlfriend's house and walked to the woven bamboo wall next to where she slept. I knocked softly on the wall and whispered, "Pang, are you still awake?" I called her name for a while and heard nothing. I waited, and then I heard her clear her throat before saying, "Sorry, I thought you had already left for Thailand, so I fell asleep." I replied, "Pang, the village smells rotten and there's a funeral going on. It's freaking me out a bit, but I really wanted to see you. Can you come out to stay with me for a bit?" "Okay," she said. As soon as Pang spoke, the funeral drum in the village suddenly stopped. I stood up and walked towards their front door, but I tripped over something soft and fell. It was too dark to see, so I reached down to feel what I had stumbled over. My hands touched a sticky face. There were 2 dead bodies lying on the ground. Just then, I heard Pang open the door. I was already freaking out and thinking that maybe Pang and her mother is dead, and that there the two bodies on the ground. Maybe the one inside the house is not Pang. Terrified, I got up and ran. As I ran, I heard the funeral drum start again, but this time it sounded much closer, as if it were chasing me. The drumming continued to follow me through the mountains until I had put enough distance between myself and the village. Only then did I hear the drum fade and return to my girlfriend's village. Shortly after that night, my family left to Thailand. As more and more people migrating into the refugee camp of Thailand, we recognized some people from my girlfriend's village. When I asked them about my girlfriend and mother, they confirmed that they're both dead outside their house. The villagers went into hiding when their village was burned down. After a while, they went back to the village to gather some foods and saw that my girlfriend and her mother were dead. Story number 2. I remember that after the Americans lost the war and fled the country, the Vietnamese soldiers continued to search every Hmong village for returning Hmong soldiers. We feared it might happen to us, so we stayed quiet. Even at night, we tried not to build fires or light candles. One day, however, Grandma B passed away. It was a hard time. Even during Grandma B's funeral at night, we only lit 1 or 2 candles inside the house. By the way, our funeral usually lasted from 3 to 7 nights and days. The candle we lit inside the house was just enough to see inside, but it was still dark. When the drummer played the funeral drum, it was the scariest moment. Everyone was so afraid the Vietnamese soldiers might hear us, but it was something that had to be done. During the funeral, if you went inside the house, you could barely see the drummer, with only the candle on the chest of the deceased providing light. The body had turned blue and black. It was unpleasant to look at. One evening, just as it was getting dark, the Vietnamese launched a bazooka missile at the home of the family holding the funeral. It was so sudden. There was a loud boom where the body was placed in the house. The blast threw the deceased and the drummer onto the ground, landing on top of each other. As night fell, everyone ran home to gather their wives and children. Before we knew it, machine gun fire and flashing lights came from up the hill. I ran to my house and told my wife and our 2 children to run. My family, along with other villagers, fled into the jungle without any food that night. We were terrified. 2 days later, 2 other men and I went back to the village to gather food for the people hiding in the jungle. We went at noon. We visited different houses, grabbing a few pots, some rice, and sweet potatoes for the children. After visiting a few homes, we reached the one where we had been holding the funeral. The deceased was still on top of the drummer, and we thought the drummer was dead. But when we got closer, he opened his eyes and looked at us. He was so weak. When we touched his arms, they felt fragile, as if all his bones were broken. He opened his mouth and tried to speak, but we could barely hear him. He said he was thirsty and asked for water. We gave him a few sips. Afterward, he told us that Grandma B, the corpse, on top of him would occasionally scratch him during the night, and he wanted us to move the body to the side. We lifted the corpse and placed her to the side. We asked him what he wanted us to do for him. We carried a rifle and a knife, but he didn't choose either. He said he probably wouldn't survive the night and only asked us to cover him because he feels cold. We placed a little blanket over him and left to check the other houses. Many villagers had been killed, and their bodies were already rotting. The village had a strong smell of decay. We found a woman and her beautiful daughter Pong, both shot dead at their doorstep. They had been waiting for their father to return from the battlefield. We weren't sure whether her husband was already dead or hiding with the other soldiers in the jungle. After gathering some food and supplies, we left the village and returned to the jungle with our people. Eventually, we all made it safely to the refugee camp of Thailand. Story number 3. My father was a soldier and he died in the battlefield. We never saw his body though. Only his military friends told us that he had died. And because of the Vietnamese missiles, they were not able to retrieve the bodies of their fallen comrades. I was still little, around 6 years old at the time. Since my father had died in the war, I lived with my mother and grandma. My mother had a lung disease that made her short of breath and very weak at the time. When we heard that the North Vietnamese soldiers were coming, we were terrified. We knew that eventually they would come to our village. One evening, the Vietnamese soldiers did come to our village. We heard bazookas and gunshots. My mother couldn't run, so she told my grandma to take me and go with the other villagers. I didn't want to leave, but my mother said that when the Vietnamese came, she would pretend to be dead so they wouldn't shoot her. She told me to go with grandma, and when she got better, she would come find us. I left with grandma and some other people to find another village. During that time, many of us are moving from village to village. We were able to find one where half of the people had already left. Therefore, we're staying in an abandoned house and hoping that the situation in the country would stabilize. After 4 weeks of living in the new village, one morning before sunrise, the North Vietnamese soldiers attacked. They started burning houses and killing villagers. I was still asleep when my grandma grabbed me, carried me on her chest, and began running with the others. But my grandma was a little slow. I could see the villagers running ahead, not waiting for us. It was still dark, so we couldn't see where the others had gone. After a while, I felt something warm on my chest, and Grandma sat me down. She told me to run after the villagers. She couldn't carry me anymore, and I had to go right away before I lost sight of them. I was crying, but I kept running and running. However, I didn't see any villagers. I kept running until daylight, when I could finally see my surroundings. In the light, I noticed that my shirt was covered in blood. It must have been my grandma's blood. Maybe she had been shot. As I looked around, I recognized the path. It was the one leading to our old village. I hadn't seen my mother in so long, and I missed her so much, so I started running toward our old village. When I got to our house, I opened the door and saw my mother lying on the bed. She turned her head to look at me, then got up, hugged me, and started touching my head, crying. My mother told me she never thought she would see me again, and that she had been waiting every day for me. My mother asked if I was hungry, and I said I was. She had boiled some vegetables the night before, and there was still some rice left, so she mixed the two and gave them to me. She held me as I ate. After I finished eating, I fell asleep in her arms. Every time I woke up, she was still holding me, so I went back to sleep. I was so tired that day. When I woke up again, it was already dark, but my mother was still holding me. She told me that she had heard the Vietnamese soldiers nearby, and that she wanted me to hide under her bed. She said she would lie down and pretend to be dead. She told me not to make a sound or come out until sunrise. I hid under the bed. There were pots and pans under there, so I hid behind them. Then I heard the Vietnamese soldiers talking, and our door opened. I saw 2 soldiers come in with flashlights and rifles. They looked around the house, flashed their lights at the bed, and then went back outside. I heard them talking and walking away. Our village was abandoned, but occasionally the soldiers would come back to check in case any villagers comes back to grab some stuffs. I whispered, "Mom, Mom." They went away. I whispered a few more times, but my mother didn't answer. I stayed hidden under the bed until I started seeing light outside. I crawled out and stood up to look at my mother, but something seemed strange. Her skin was all dry, and she didn't even look like my mother. She looked like she had been dead for a while. I got scared and started crying as I walked outside. That day, I stayed outside all day because I didn't know what had happened to my mother. Around sunset, 4 Hmong men came to our village to look for stuffs to take back to their hiding spot. They found me and took me with them as they searched house after house. They brought me to the jungle, where many other villagers were hiding. We stayed in the jungle for about 2 weeks before crossing over to Thailand. Story number 4. During the Vietnam War, there were many widows, which is why Hmong men at that time had many wives. My father was one of those men, and he often spent time at his 2 new wives' houses instead of with my mother, my siblings, and me. One morning, when my mother was frying some pork in a pot full of oil, she sat down and was peeling some bamboo shoots. My father came home that morning from his 3rd wife's house. My mother was angry, and they started arguing because my father hadn't come home all week to be with us. My mother was still peeling bamboo shoots and wasn't paying attention. My father, angry, grabbed the pot full of pork and oil behind her and poured everything onto her head. My mother fell to the ground, crying and screaming. Her cries were not human, more like something terrifying. My siblings and I were crying too. The villagers came to see what was going on, and everyone was lecturing my father, while the women brought water and poured it onto my mother. After that, my father no longer slept at our house. Every time he came by, it was because he was looking for something or needed something. My mother had a huge scar on one side of her head, down to her left cheek. Only one side of her head still had hair. She looked frightening. Even little kids cried when they saw her, so she would cover her head and half her face with a piece of cloth. One evening, after everyone had come home from farming and the sun had just set, we heard gunshots in the village and people screaming. It seemed like a lot of North Vietnamese soldiers had come to burn down our village. My mother told me and my 2 brothers to hide under the bed and not come out. She took off the cloth that covered her head and went outside, leaving the door wide open. I saw my mother get on the ground, crawling around and crying like a mad woman. I saw some Vietnamese soldiers come to our door, and my mother was crying and begging them to shoot her. She grabbed one of the soldiers' rifles and held it against her head. The soldier didn't shoot her. He yanked the rifle away and kicked her in the shoulder, causing her to fall to the ground. She then crawled to another soldier and hugged his leg. That soldier handed his rifle to another as he tried to get my mother off of him. The soldiers seemed either scared or disgusted by my mother, so they walked away without entering our house. I guess those soldiers were Buddhists. They couldn't kill or disrespect someone they considered crazy or disabled. My mother's act of pretending to be insane actually saved me and my 2 brothers. That night, we stayed in our house without lighting any candles. We ate in the dark. The village was eerily quiet and frightening. The next morning we got up and looked outside. There were no Vietnamese soldiers. My mother took us outside, and we walked around the village, scared, holding her hand. Everywhere we turned, there was a dead body. I think everyone in the village was dead. We went to my father's 3rd wife's house, but he wasn't there. His 3rd wife and her children were all dead. Then we went to his 2nd wife's house, and there he was. He, his 2nd wife, and her children were all dead. My father had been shot in both legs and in the stomach. My mother didn't cry. She just walked us back to our house, where we packed up and left for my grandparents' village. When we migrate to the refugee camp Ban Vinai in Thailand, we stayed in section 2 of the camp. If you lived in Ban Vinai and remember a woman with a head and face scar, that was my mother. We came to the United States in 1989. My mother passed away in 2017. That's all for this video. Thank you for making all the way through and supporting my stories. Have a wonderful day or night.